This is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Be sure to check out our blog and our YouTube channel and our Facebook group and our great sponsors, Italy Rooting, Phil Italy, and Abitativa Casa. And my guest today is Paula Gambarota, and she's an associate professor in the Italian department at Rutgers University here in New Jersey. So welcome, Paula. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Bob. That's really a nice occasion.
Oh, no, I'm very excited because I love to talk to people who have closer roots to Italy than I do, and some of my listeners. So it's very special to have you here for sure. Where's your family from in Italy?
Both of my parents are from Irpinia, so from little villages in the region of Campania. Of course, the capital is Naples, but they both descended from immigrants. So on my father's side, they emigrated to Argentina, Buenos Aires. On my mother's side, they emigrated to both families. However, as soon as the fathers of the family retired, went back to Italy. And so my mother was born in Italy. She was the last child. My father, unfortunately, got to know his father only when he was approximately 20 years old, because he didn't have enough money to go back to Italy. While my grandfather on my mother's side, with the boat, at least once a year, he visited the family. So it's a story of separation mostly, the story of my grandparents and parents. And yes, I was born in Avellino, but since my father was a judge, he was moved very often. So we moved to Lucera, which is a beautiful town. Friedrich built a castle in the 12th century there. This is in Apulia. We moved, many times. And then we ended up in Naples after the earthquake of 1980. We lost our home and we moved to Naples, and there is where I studied at the Istituto Orientale in Naples. And after that, I studied German studies, and I was a teacher of German. And then I moved to Munich and Berlin. I lived there for 2 years in Berlin, 1 year in Munich. And I did a PhD in German studies. But then, I met my husband in Berlin, and he was an American, but from Prague, from the Czech Republic. And our shared language was German. I didn't speak Czech. And at a certain point, I decided to join him in the United States after 4 years, of commuting, transatlantic commute. And so I came here, and I must say that in those years, it was very difficult, if you were not a native speaker, to become a professor, an academic in the field. For instance, I was a professor of German at that point, of German culture. But it was very difficult because universities favored either Americans speaking German, or German, of course, native speakers. And so I decided to begin again. And I studied Italian literature here at Yale University, so to have more chance, to find a good position. And then, as many academics nowadays, I became a little bit of a nomad. I taught at different universities at Penn State. Then I taught at UConn. Then I taught at Harvard, and now I'm teaching at Rutgers. It's been now since 2007. So I've been here in New Brunswick, in New Jersey, for a long time.
And it's funny. I never been to Rutgers until I came, back in was it February, I think. And we lived in New Jersey for like 15 years. Then we lived in Florida for a while. We came back. We've been back 10 years. Never been to, and I was never to Princeton until just a little while ago. My friend Tony took me to a wine tasting in Princeton. Both towns are really, really nice. And we were sampling the Sorrentino wines in Princeton from Vesuvius.
Have you sampled the wines from the area around Avellino?
Only when we would only.
Greco di Tufo, Taurasi. This is an incredible, good wine. Now there are, Mastro Berardino, for instance, exports a lot, but there are lots of good brands, of this wine. We have to.
Tony he's a wine expert. He's been doing this 50 years. So we've started a YouTube series. We're going through all the regions of Italy. We haven't hit Campania yet. I guess we'll be there in a few weeks. And he's just got so much knowledge about wine. There's so much to know about wine. And
yeah, Yeah,
Unbelievable.
it's infinite.
It's unbelievable. So that's an interesting story. So your parents' families immigrated to two different places and then
Yeah.
wound up going back. That's very, very interesting for
I don't
sure.
know whether I'm happy about that because, I had to relearn English here while I could have been born here, no immigration to look for jobs. Because, after one generation, my father and my mother had great careers in Italy, I must say, because, their parents were able to send them to university. My mother went to college. This was really rare for her generation. But as you know, immigrants really care for education. So, but then, we have four children and we all emigrated again because in Naples there were in the south of Italy, as we know, there is high unemployment, 21%. It's a high unemployment rate of unemployment. And so, we live all, my brother is a professor of physics in France. My sister is a doctor in Milan. The other sister is a lawyer in Trento, in the Alps, not
Mhm.
Trento, but Trento in Italy. So we are all, there is a new diaspora now. It's.
Yeah. And I think I mentioned to you when we met the first time that my um great great grandfather, no, was it my great let's see, my great grandfather, uh he was he from what I saw from a newspaper article in New Jersey, no less, in 1923 or something like that. He was a Supreme Court justice in Naples, but I've never been able to actually prove it other than seeing this little newspaper article when my great grandmother passed away.
Yeah, yeah. My father ended his career as Procuratore Generale of Naples. Yeah, yeah. So it's it's a nice coincidence.
Yeah, and I knew that I knew that they had come from a family of lawyers going back um to my great grandmother's family, uh, and they were, as far back as like the early 1800s, they were
Mm.
lawyers.
Oh, wow. No, as I said from my short story, actually it's extraordinary the path that my mother and my father, given their background, as
So so
they came from poor families. Yeah.
yeah. So when did you actually arrive in the United States? What year?
90. So it's a long time.
I think you said you were working on a book, or is it
Yes,
finished? Or?
I've been working for many years actually on a book which is on American Naples. I was very surprised, which is about the liberation of Italy by the Allies, and in particular Naples was governed by the military government, Allied military government, from October 1st, 1943 to January 1st, 46. So, and that's why, many historians speak of American Naples, because actually the American cultures, in contrast to the British or the French culture, because they were all there, these troops, and also, civil officers and so on. But the American culture was the one that took more, that really took roots in Naples. So also because of all the exchanges. You can imagine the military, at least the American military, made really an effort to send when they invaded Italy, to send Italian American, lots of Italian Americans there, so that they knew, some of them knew the languages, of course, the dialects even, and so they could really relate better to the population. There were wonderful moments of encounters. Oh, this is my cousin,
Mm.
it was really nice in Sicily and in Naples. But of course, Naples is actually the first long-term occupation and in modern history. Of American occupation in modern history on the continent of Europe, in a country that had been a former enemy, because as everybody knows, Italy was on the side of the Axis, so Germany and Japan. But anyway, I was very curious. I discovered this because I didn't know. I didn't know at all that Naples had been under this military government for such a long time. I discovered this when I was teaching a course on Naples with my students. And then, we were reading a text by Curzio Malaparte, The Skin is called, which is about this period. And I had also some veterans in my class, and we began to discuss this issue. And I thought, this should be read because it's such occupation, of course, it's such even when it is a good occupation, like the American one, the liberators, no? It has so many complications, there's so many ambivalent feelings because it is difficult for an army to be, I mean, for the troops who were there to be at the same time, to the liberators, but to govern by military rules. So it was a difficult dance from all sides, which in a way was, I would say, marked Naples in a strong way. But of course, I'm not studying later text. I'm interested in the testimony of people who lived through the experience. Just to add a little bit about my interest, of course, I was also, my parents, I had also tales from stories. I heard stories from my parents about this period, little images and flash memories. And so I wanted to know a little more about this. Also, my grandfather was Italian American, so I wanted to understand the ambivalences when Italian Americans meet Italians and all of these issues. And of course, I discovered an incredible amount of sources by famous people. John Steinbeck was there. Robert Capa, the best photographs are made by Robert Capa and George Rogers. But there was also Margaret Burke White, a woman there, photographing the living conditions of the people, the port, wonderful photographs. And then, as I was saying, John Steinbeck, Hoagy Carmichael, I don't know how you pronounce this in English, but he's a jazz musician. And he wrote a song, I Met Her in Via Roma, because of course the most typical, the stereotype about the occupation were the signorine, no? Because everybody was trying to make a living, and unfortunately that's the dark side of the occupation in Naples. There was a lot of prostitution, and this became also a little bit of, on one side a joke, on one side a tragic situation. So it's a very, how can I say, it's a story that I think it's worth telling because of the density of these feelings and the kind of interactions that happened. And I decided to tell the story. But as I said, I went into three archives, no, many more. In Europe, the Imperial War Museum in England, then in Naples, all the Rome, the State Archive. I went to the Citadel here because the general who liberated Naples was General Mark Clark, and he was the president of the Citadel. So all of his papers are there. Then, Library of Congress. I mean, the testimonies that I collected, it's a huge archive, a huge database that I now have. And it took me 10 years to, in a sense, to have an overview, because one of the things I wanted to do, and then probably you can ask questions because I'm talking too much. I wanted to look at this 3 years that's why it has been taking me so many years, from different perspectives. So I have testimonies from British officer and British, simple soldiers, Italian Americans, officers, generals, intelligence officer. And of course, the intelligence officers were mostly Italian Americans. For instance, Alfred de Grazia, the great economist, he was a young man in Naples, as intelligence, and he was, interrogating people and trying to understand this way there. Or another intelligent person, the Italian American, was, you can ask your friend Ron Garutti, Daniel Assumma. And the family Assumma gave me all the letters that Daniel Assumma, who was from New York City, who was the interpreter at the headquarters of Allied headquarters, gave me, boxes and boxes of correspondence with his mother, with his sisters. And, I went through these boxes just to have other, other kind of testimonies. And Assumma was in his 30s. He was a principal of a school. He had studied at Columbia English. And so it's a very, very kind, very, how can I say, informed voice. That's why I like it a lot, because it's very sensitive, how can I say, toward what the Neapolitans were living through. I cannot say the same for many British soldiers who, of course, saw the Neapolitans as enemies, as uncivilized, the Arabs, they called them, or Africans. And so they had a little bit more of a colonial attitude toward the Neapolitans, while the Americans had had a much more open mind, and I said,
Well, I think with the Americans, there was just so many more, like you said, so many more people
yeah,
with family there. So naturally, yeah. I mean, they had aunts and uncles and cousins. Some of them probably even had parents there. Who knows? My favorite Neapolitan song is "Too Far Americano." And
oh, Naples,
that tells the story kind of almost. Right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. You know, Naples produced so many songs during the occupation. One was American. I met her in via Roma with a signorina, but the many were Tammoriata Nera. È nato un creatore, è nato nero. You know, it's practically about the relationship between black soldiers, American soldiers, and the Neapolitan women. And so, and so the shock of having a white woman giving birth to a black boys. And there are lots of black Neapolitans, you know, who then some emigrated, some became famous, like James Senese, the great saxophone player and composer, no? Who is now 75, I think. And so, or for instance, Dove sta Zazà? Where is Zazà? Which is also in the middle of a Festa di Piedigrutta, one of the big festivals, song festivals in Naples, tradition from the 19th century. This lady goes lost. Practically, she decides to leave her poor Neapolitan fiancé and probably to move to a more wealthy, you know, soldiers, allied soldiers. Yeah, yeah. And, you know, many songs were, oh, Santa Chiara, Monastero di Santa Chiara. You know, the Church of Santa Chiara, the cathedral, beautiful Gothic cathedral with this extraordinary, you know, chiostro, how do you say? Cloister?
Cloister, yeah, Cloister.
With tiles from the 17th century, beautiful colors, mandarins. It's, you know, I remember when I studied, I used to go there whenever I wanted to have a break from noisy Naples. And anyway, my great surprise, Santa Chiara looks intact, you know, but it was totally destroyed. You know, only some walls during the war, during the air raids. Naples, after German towns and Milan, was the most bombed city, you know, during in Europe. 104 air raids.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow. Mm.
So the whole historical center was destroyed, and all the beautiful hotels on the shore, but these were destroyed by the Germans. You know, because when the Italians made the armistice with the Allies, you know, Hitler said, General Scholl in Naples, that Naples had to be reduced to ash and slum, how do you say, in dust and ashes. And so, you know, they destroyed all they bomb. I mean, they put bombs. They let factories explode. The most important factories like Italcide, you know, where steel was produced, or so they destroyed all the factories on the coast, all these beautiful hotels, so that when the Allies would arrive, they wouldn't have where to lodge. And this caused a lot of friction with the population, because so many people had to evacuate their own apartments. And of course, they became resentful toward the Neapolitans, because and they took over not only buildings like La Reggia di Napoli, or institutional buildings, you know, for barracks, but also private apartments. And since they had in Naples, there was the headquarters and also the government, you know, the Allied government, since until January 1st, 1946, there were so many civilians, I mean, Allied civil officers who were working there, that so many apartments were requisitioned. And this caused a lot of friction with the Neapolitans who couldn't go back home.
Yeah, I can imagine. You
And
know,
this was intentional from the Germans, you know, Germans, done
yeah,
intentionally so that they would have more of a hard time. Otherwise, there were so many hotels in Naples, they would have all lived in hotels.
it wouldn't have been a problem. Yeah. And I only learned the last few years that, you know, my grandmother was still in touch with, you know, her family, her brothers and her nieces and nephews. And you know, I try to think about, you know, what was it like for especially my father's parents, because they were in Naples. They lived in Torre del Greco and around there. You know, what was it like for my grandmother and my grandparents? My father was just enlisting in the army, knowing that they had family there and worrying about them. And, you know, there was no, I mean, maybe they could call once in a while, but basically you're relying on letters. that could take weeks and weeks to get there.
And
So it must
because
have been difficult on both sides, you know?
yeah, of course, of course. I see it from the letters between Assumma, Danny Assumma, and his mothers and his sisters. You know how difficult it was. The soldiers worrying about the business in the United States with rationing and with all the problems, and the family worrying about the life of their sons and daughters. It was difficult, and especially the first months. I mean, after the 1 month of German occupation, you know, where so much was destroyed and people were starving because, you know, Naples was in a state of siege. Nothing came from the countryside in town. And so people were eating all possible things. And these are the memories that I have from my parents, you know. Eating
Yeah,
bread done with stones, you know, stone flour. You know, my grandmother was just grinding the stones and trying to put some of this so that they would feel. I mean, it's a terrible story that you learn about how
yeah.
hungry
You know,
they were.
my mother's brother, he was left behind there. And when they came, he was 2 years old and he stayed with his grandparents. So my cousin, you know, who was about 14 during the war in Bari, and I said, well, what did you eat? And she's beans, you know, but they would live, you know, they lived out in the country on the farm. For them,
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
it wasn't probably as much as a problem
I
as it
was
was in
going
the
to say
cities.
that this was a delicacy. Beans or
Mm.
potatoes, they were delicacy. Usually they began to eat the ration because the Americans loosened up their regulation not to feed the population. You know, they understood that they had to feed the population because the population was starving. And so they had some flowers flown in. And there are stories about pane bianco, the white bread that they were able to eat that are really incredible. There are also documentary films about the first time that these Neapolitans were seeing again real bread.
Well, you know, my uncle, he was blind in one eye. And when he read the eye chart, he read this chart with the same eye twice. He switched hands. And they found that out and they said, well, he wouldn't have to go overseas. But then when they found out that he was fluent in Italian, they sent him to he was a guard in Africa of Italian prisoners. And he would eat with the Italian prisoners because they were giving the Italian prisoners like spaghetti and canned tomatoes. And he said we were getting, you know, junk out of a can and they had the good stuff. So he would go eat with them.
There are bad stories, you know, about the polvere di piselli, these soups that was imported to Italy just to give people something to eat. And this was pea dust, practically, made with peas, green peas. And they called it, you know, this is like colla, this is like glue. You know, I've heard many stories. For instance, the father of a famous publishing house, publishers, Guida, the house had lots of holes and he was trying to fill the holes in with this soup, pea soup, because it was like glue. And then after a couple of months, of course, lots of insects came because they were going to eat
They were going to eat this. That's funny.
I mean, there are lots of funny stories and less funny stories. I try to balance them in my book because, you know, you want to to try to say, to show all the sides of stories. What I can say is that the differences are huge among the life of people, you know, because the wealthier one left Naples. They were living in Capri, Sorrento. For instance, the great philosopher Benedetto Croce, no? He moved to Sorrento from Naples. And then there was also a very, very adventurous operation, which the BBC, Radio Londra, announced. Two officers, one was Munte, the son of Axel Munte, was a doctor, a Swedish doctor, who studied typhoid in Naples. But anyway, the son was an officer. And he knew about Benedetto Croce because he was very, very cultivated from this noble family and so on. And he, together with Salvadori, who became an historian here at Smith College, and he was an officer in the intelligence OSS, in the intelligence office of the United States at that point. He was recruited. They went with a boat and pick up Croce and one of his daughter and brought them to Capri, which had been already liberated, because they feared that the Germans would take him as an hostage and exchange some big shot, you know. And so, you know, this was an operation that was publicized in all the radios, in the New York Times, you know, the liberation of Benedetto Croce, the philosopher. Of course, this is a big exception, but people who were wealthy, you know, did not stay in Naples. I discovered in an archive in Italy, in Pieve di Santo Stefano. This is an exception, and I would like to publish an aristocratic family, the Rodinò, Catholic family. Rodinò father was a senator of the Christian Democratic Party, and so they were banned under fascism. But they stayed in Naples. And so I discovered the diary, 1,400 pages of the son, Giuseppe Rodinò, and I really would like to publish it because this is such an exception to have a person who studied, who could write, write and especially convey in an interesting way, what was happening. That I'm gathering lots of news about the cost, very practical news, the cost of food on the individual, goods on the black market, and at the same time the cost, how they were celebrating wedding under these conditions, for instance. So the battesimi, how do you say?
Of baptism?
Baptism, yeah, of their children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my cousin, she sold on the black market in Bari. She used to go. They said she used to go, and she said it was dangerous because it was dangerous to begin with, but if you got caught by the British or the Americans, you'd be in trouble.
Of course. You would be even more in trouble by the Italian,
Probably,
Italian Carabinieri, because actually the American became very understanding, let's say so, and also in particular in Naples, many American soldiers, collaborated with black marketeers. So it was a very, very particular situation. And the famous stories of Il Re di Poggioreale. And there is a film, an American film about this guy, which was Giuseppe Navarra. He was a mafioso. And he was the king of this Poggioreale, of this district, because he was able to bring food in the district and distribute not only food, but also favors, because he was in contact with Vito Genovese, who was brought by the Americans, by Charles Poletti in particular, the governor of the second governor of Naples, Charles Poletti, brought also Vito Genovese, hoping this American convicted mafioso, hoping to have a bridge, with the local mafia through him, to establish a bridge through him. So
that's fascinating. It's fascinating, and I don't think anybody knows about it. So when do you think you're going to be ready to publish?
I'm just revising the manuscript, so I hope that next year it's coming. It's a 400 pages manuscript. Different publishers came and say they are interested. And so I hope that next year the book can come out. And I also had the request of possibly doing this PBS series, which is called American Experience. And it's a documentary, the American Experience. Who knows, maybe, we'll do also something for television, a documentary, because it's really, now that I collected so many interesting materials and many are songs, films, clips, photographs, a book cannot render really the richness of this.
Yeah, but it's a fascinating topic, and I didn't know, and I'm sure a lot of other people didn't know. So just before we go, I just wanted to ask you one more thing about the Italian community at Rutgers, and certainly if there's any students that would, like to tell their story, I'd love to have them on.
Absolutely. Do you prefer graduate students or undergraduate students, or does it make a difference?
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
Okay. It has to have an interesting story, let's say so to say.
Yeah, if they want to talk about, why they're so excited about the Italian culture, or if they want to talk about their family and things like that, I'd love to have them, because I don't get too many young people.
Okay, then that's we have so many, and as I was saying, we have two Italian origins now, undergraduates who loved so much, and they're writing lesson units on dialects. One is from Sicily, the other one Neapolitan, and maybe they would like to talk about.
Yes, I'd love to have them on. And then certainly too, I have a monthly newsletter. If any of them, have a short story or an essay or something that they want me to put in the newsletter.
It's published online, the newsletter?
Yeah.
Wow, this is great. This could be also a great opportunity for our graduate students to publish.
Sure, I'll send you the link so you could take a look at it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
This is nice. This is very nice.
I think I have about 1,500 subscribers now, something like that. And then, a lot of people just look at it and probably don't subscribe, but Yeah, I've been doing it for a
That's
few years.
mostly the case. I have to disappoint you. It's mostly the case, but it's interesting. Yeah, yeah. Please
Yeah,
send
so
me.
I'll send it. And you could, like I said,
Okay.
anybody who wants to.
Let me know if you want. I don't know how it how your podcast looks, but I have so many incredible pictures. If you want some, I can about Naples. During the occupation, the soldier's guide to Naples, like a tourist guide. I mean, okay. Thank
All
you
right.
very much.
All right. Thank
Both.
you.